November 28, 1941, 6:47 a.m., 15 kilometers west of Moscow. Leutnant Hans Richter of the Wehrmacht's 258th Infantry Division crouched in a frozen trench, watching his breath crystallize in air that burned his lungs. The temperature had dropped to -35 Celsius overnight. 3 men in his platoon had frozen to death in their sleep. But Richter wasn't worried about the cold. He was thinking about Moscow's spires, visible through his field glasses across the snow. Victory was so close he could almost touch it. The Red Army was beaten. Everyone knew it. German intelligence reported Soviet reserves exhausted, their best divisions destroyed in the great encirclements of summer and fall. Moscow would fall by Christmas. The war would be over. What Lieutenant Richter didn't know, what German high command refused to believe, was that 15 fresh Soviet divisions were moving west from Siberia at that very moment. Divisions trained in conditions that made Moscow's winter look mild. Soldiers who viewed -40 as comfortable weather. Men the Germans had dismissed as racially inferior Mongol hordes. In 7 days, those assumptions would shatter like ice under a sledgehammer. The Siberian counteroffensive would push the Wehrmacht back 150 miles and deliver Germany its first major defeat of World War II. And men like Hans Richter would learn that nature cares nothing for ideology, and winter kills the unprepared regardless of race. If stories of courage and ingenuity move you, please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us honor the memories of those who served. Hans Richter had grown up believing in German racial superiority the way other children believed in gravity. It was simply how the world worked. The Aryan race stood at civilization's pinnacle. Slavs occupied a lower tier, useful as labor but inferior stock. And Asiatics? Barely human. This wasn't just propaganda. It was doctrine, taught in schools, preached from pulpits, codified in law. The entire Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, rested on this assumption. The Asiatic Bolshevik enemy would collapse when faced with superior Germanic will and organization, and for 5 months, reality seemed to confirm ideology. June through November 1941 had been a symphony of German victories. The Wehrmacht encircled and destroyed Soviet armies at Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, Bryansk, Vyazma. 3 million Red Army soldiers captured. 15,000 Soviet tanks destroyed. The advance seemed unstoppable. By late November, German forward units were so close to Moscow they could see the Kremlin through binoculars. Newspapers in Berlin prepared victory editions. Officers planned occupation duties. Soldiers wrote letters home promising they'd be back for Christmas. The prevailing view of Soviet troops, especially those from the Asian regions, combined military contempt with racial hatred. Intelligence briefings described them as poorly trained, poorly led, lacking initiative. Asiatic hordes who would break and run when faced with disciplined German fire. Nobody in German high command paid attention to one crucial detail. These assessments came from fighting European Russians. The Siberians were something else entirely. While the Wehrmacht advanced on Moscow, a different kind of battle played out 7,000 kilometers east in Tokyo. Richard Sorge, a German journalist who was actually a Soviet spy, worked feverishly to answer one question that would determine the war's outcome. Would Japan attack the Soviet Union from the east? If Japan struck Siberia, Stalin would have to keep his Far East reserves in place. Moscow would fall. Germany would win. Sorge had cultivated sources deep in the Japanese government over years of careful work. In October 1941, those sources delivered the answer Stalin desperately needed. Japan had decided to strike south against America and Britain, not north against the USSR. The Japanese ambassador to Berlin told Sorge directly, "Our thrust will be southward." Sorge transmitted this intelligence to Moscow on October 14, 1941. It was his last message before the Japanese arrested him. But that single transmission changed history. Stalin, who trusted almost no one, believed Sorge's intelligence because it aligned with other indicators. More importantly, he had no choice. Moscow was about to fall. He needed those Siberian divisions. The order went out. Transfer 15 divisions from the Far East to the Moscow front. These weren't ordinary troops. They were something the Germans had never encountered. The 78th Rifle Division came from Khabarovsk, where winter temperatures routinely hit -40. The 82nd Motorized Division trained in Mongolia, where wind chill could freeze exposed flesh in 90 seconds. The 239th Rifle Division recruited from Yakutia, where humans have lived in subarctic conditions for thousands of years. These weren't garrison troops. They were hunter warriors who'd grown up in environments more hostile than any battlefield. Men who could build fire without matches, navigate by stars, and survive for days on minimal rations. Soldiers who viewed the Moscow winter, terrible by European standards, as merely cold weather. Their training reflected their environment. Standard drills included 40-kilometer ski marches in full combat gear, night operations at -30, building snow shelters that provided warmth without fire, close-quarters combat in heavy winter clothing. All the skills that made no sense to European soldiers but meant survival in Siberia. Their equipment matched their environment. Quilted Telogreka jackets that provided warmth without bulk. Valenki felt boots that insulated even when wet. White camouflage that made them invisible against snow. PPSH-41. Submachine guns that functioned reliably at temperatures where German weapons froze solid. But more than equipment or training, these men possessed something the exhausted Germans lacked. They were fresh, rested, eager. While the Wehrmacht had been fighting for 5 months straight, the Siberian divisions were at full strength, fully supplied, and moving toward their first major engagement. German intelligence knew these transfers were happening. Radio intercepts detected troop movements. Aerial reconnaissance spotted trains heading west. But German racial ideology filtered this information through contempt. High Command Assessment, November 1941. Asiatic troops from the Far East, minimal combat value, unlikely to affect the situation. They were catastrophically wrong. While Siberian divisions moved west, the Wehrmacht slowly froze in place outside Moscow. The German army that had rolled across Europe with mechanized precision was discovering that Russian winter was a different kind of enemy. German summer uniforms provided no protection against -30 temperatures. Soldiers stuffed newspapers under their tunics for insulation. They wrapped their feet in paper because their boots weren't designed for extreme cold. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Weapons failed. Lubrication in machine guns congealed. Bolt-action rifles froze shut. Artillery recoil systems fractured. Tank engines wouldn't start without lighting fires underneath them. Vehicles became metal coffins, warm inside from body heat, but one mechanical failure meant slow death. German logistics, so efficient in France, collapsed in Russia. Supply lines stretched 1,500 kilometers through partisan-infested territory. Winter clothing shipments piled up in Warsaw, while soldiers at the front died of exposure. Ammunition arrived, but engine oil didn't. The army received food, but not the means to cook it. By late November, the Wehrmacht's offensive capabilities had degraded to near zero. Divisions were at 50% strength. Tanks were immobilized. Artillery couldn't traverse frozen ground to new positions. The army could barely hold its positions, much less attack. But German officers still believed Moscow would fall. They just needed one more push, one final offensive. Then they could rest in the comfort of captured Soviet buildings while they waited for spring. Leutnant Hans Richter shared this view. On December 4th, he wrote in his diary, "We are so close. One more kilometer and Moscow is ours. The Ivans are finished. Then we can finally warm ourselves." That night, the temperature dropped to -38°C, and 15 Siberian divisions completed their deployment into positions around Moscow. Richter woke to the sound of artillery, not German artillery, incoming. Thousands of rounds walking across the frozen landscape in a systematic barrage that spoke of fresh guns, full ammunition stocks, and precise fire control. Then the shelling stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, Richter heard something that made his blood freeze colder than the air. Absolutely nothing. No engine noise, no shouted orders, no clanking equipment. German defensive doctrine said Soviet attacks would come with tanks, massed infantry, and chaotic noise. What emerged from the pre-dawn darkness was something different. White shapes materialized out of the snow. Not walking, not running, gliding. Men on skis, perfectly camouflaged, moving in small groups with terrifying discipline. No shouting, no signals, just silent, purposeful movement. Richter's machine gun team tried to respond. The MG-34 fired 3 rounds before ice in the belt feed froze it solid. The gunner frantically worked the charging handle. Nothing. The Siberian soldiers closed to 50 meters, then 30. They still hadn't fired. They were hunting, not fighting, picking their targets, conserving ammunition, using terrain and movement with skills that came from tracking elk across frozen taiga. When they finally opened fire, it was with PPSH-41 submachine guns that worked flawlessly at -40. Short, precise bursts, no wasted ammunition. Every burst found flesh. Richter's platoon fell apart. Half the men's rifles wouldn't fire. Those that did jammed after 3 shots. German soldiers tried to run but found themselves floundering in snow that was knee-deep. The Siberians glided over the same snow on their skis. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a hunt. By 8 a.m., Richter's company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of 120 men who'd held that section of line, 47 were dead, 38 captured, and 35 had fled. The Siberians had taken 6 casualties. This scene repeated itself across 200 kilometers of front. Everywhere the pattern was the same. Silent approach. Precise fire. German disintegration. Soviet advance. The Siberian counteroffensive had begun, and the Wehrmacht, for the first time in the war, was running away. What made the Siberian soldiers so effective wasn't just equipment or training. It was mindset. These men approached winter combat the way their ancestors had approached hunting. Patience, silence, understanding of terrain, and ruthless efficiency. German doctrine emphasized firepower and frontal assault. Siberian doctrine emphasized infiltration and precision. While German units attacked in waves, Siberian units moved in small groups, sometimes just pairs, using terrain and weather to approach within meters before opening fire. They understood that winter warfare was about conservation, heat, ammunition, energy. German units burned calories trying to stay warm. Siberian units built snow shelters that required no fire, consumed hot soup that provided maximum calories, and moved efficiently to avoid sweating, which meant hypothermia. They mastered night operations. German units, exhausted and cold, could barely maintain watches after dark. Siberian units launched their most aggressive attacks at night, using darkness and blowing snow to approach German positions undetected. They'd be inside German trenches before defenders knew they were under attack. Their tactics exploited every German weakness. When German machine guns froze, Siberian troops closed to bayonet range. When German vehicles wouldn't start, Siberian cavalry appeared, actual horses, adapted to cold, carrying troops that could maneuver while German armor sat immobile. But perhaps their greatest advantage was psychological. German soldiers had been told these were inferior Asiatic hordes. Instead, they faced disciplined, well-equipped troops who were clearly more at home in winter conditions than the Wehrmacht could ever be. The realization shattered German morale. If racial ideology was wrong about this, what else was it wrong about? Within 48 hours of the counteroffensive's start, German units across the entire Moscow sector were in retreat. Not tactical withdrawal, full retreat, often in disorder, leaving behind equipment that wouldn't function and wounded who couldn't be evacuated. The 258th Infantry Division, Richter's unit, fell back 15 kilometers in 3 days, then 25 more. The retreat became a rout, became a desperate flight. Richter's diary, December 8th. We called them Mongol hordes, subhuman, racially inferior. Then December came. They wore white camouflage while we wore field gray that showed against snow. They skied through drifts we couldn't walk through. They hunted us like wolves hunt deer. We learned, nature doesn't care about ideology. Winter kills the unprepared, regardless of race. By mid-December, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back 100 kilometers from Moscow. By January 7, 1942, the Siberian divisions and their reinforcements had recaptured territory along a front of 1,000 kilometers, pushing the Germans back 150 to 250 kilometers depending on sector. The statistics tell the story. German losses, December 5, 1941, January 7, 1942. 145,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, 500 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 1,300 artillery pieces, lost 7,000 vehicles, abandoned Soviet gains. 11,000 square kilometers, recaptured German offensive capacity, destroyed Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility, shattered first major German defeat of World War II. But numbers don't capture the psychological impact. German soldiers who'd been told they were racially superior discovered they were simply unprepared. Officers who'd planned victory parties in Moscow found themselves conducting desperate defensive actions in frozen villages. A military that had conquered most of Europe learned it could be beaten. The Eastern Front would continue for 3 more years. Germany would launch new offensives, but the Wehrmacht would never again approach Moscow. The tide had turned. Hans Richter survived the winter of 1941 to 42. Barely. He lost 3 toes to frostbite during the January retreat. His division, once 12,000 strong, counted fewer than 4,000 effective soldiers by February. After the war, in the 1970s, Soviet historians located Richter living in Hamburg and interviewed him about his experiences. His assessment was brutally honest. We underestimated them because we hated them. Our ideology told us Slavs were inferior and Asiatics were barely human. So when intelligence reported Siberian divisions moving to Moscow, we dismissed them as negligible. We focused on their race, not their capabilities. Those Siberian troops weren't inferior, they were specialists. The winter conditions that disabled us were conditions they'd trained for their entire lives. When our weapons froze, Theirs worked. When we floundered in snow, they glided over it. When we huddled in inadequate shelters, they operated with confidence. The great lesson of December 1941 wasn't about racial superiority, it was about preparation and environment. They were ready for Russian winter. We weren't. Nature doesn't care about ideology. Winter kills the unprepared regardless of what flag they serve or what race they claim to be. We lost more than Moscow that December. We lost the belief that will and racial character could overcome material reality. The Siberians taught us. Better equipment, better preparation, and understanding your environment matter more than ideology. The 15 Siberian divisions that participated in the December counteroffensive would go on to distinguished service throughout the war. Several received Guards designation, the Red Army's highest honor. Many of their soldiers earned Hero of the Soviet Union medals. But their greatest contribution wasn't measured in decorations. It was strategic and psychological. Strategic impact: save Moscow at the critical moment, force Germany into a defensive war, prove Soviet ability to conduct successful operations, gave Stalin confidence to demand more from his armies. Psychological impact: shattered Wehrmacht's myth of invincibility, demonstrated that ideology couldn't substitute for preparation, forced Germans to respect Soviet military capability, boosted Soviet morale at their darkest hour. The lesson of the Siberian divisions resonates beyond World War II. Military history is littered with forces that underestimated enemies based on prejudice rather than capability. The Wehrmacht's racism blinded them to the reality that environmental adaptation and proper preparation trump ideology every time. Modern military doctrine learned: never underestimate an enemy fighting in their environment. Ideology is not a force multiplier. Proper equipment matters more than will. Training for specific conditions beats general superiority. Understanding terrain and weather is as important as firepower. December 1941 proved several fundamental truths about warfare. Environment is a weapon. The Siberians didn't just fight in winter, they weaponized it. They understood that an enemy who's cold, hungry, and exhausted is already half beaten. By operating efficiently in conditions that disabled the Germans, they multiplied their combat power. Preparation beats ideology every time. German racial theory said they were superior. Soviet preparation said otherwise. When belief confronted reality at -35°C, reality won decisively. Specialists defeat generalists in extreme conditions. The Wehrmacht was an excellent general-purpose army. The Siberian divisions were winter warfare specialists. In winter conditions, specialists dominated. Logistics determines capability. German soldiers couldn't fight effectively because they lacked proper clothing, functioning weapons, and adequate food. Soviet soldiers excelled because their logistics supported winter operations. Strategy means nothing if your troops are too cold to pull triggers. Underestimating enemies is catastrophic. German racism led to intelligence failures, inadequate preparation, and strategic blindness. The price was Germany's first major defeat and the beginning of their ultimate destruction. Hans Richter lived to age 78, dying in Hamburg in 1996. He spent his post-war years as a teacher, and every year on December 5th, he told his students about the day ideology met reality outside Moscow. His final interview, recorded in 1994, "Young people ask me, how could you believe in such obvious lies? They don't understand how ideology shapes perception. We saw what we expected to see, filtered everything through racial prejudice, and dismissed evidence that contradicted our beliefs. The Siberians taught us better. They didn't argue with our ideology. They simply demonstrated that reality doesn't negotiate. You can believe you're superior all you want. The man with working weapons and warm clothing will kill you regardless of your beliefs. December 1941 was the beginning of the end, not just of the Moscow offensive, of Germany's entire war, because once you've learned that your foundational beliefs are lies, everything built on them collapses. We lost more than territory that winter. We lost certainty. And certainty, once lost, never fully returns. The 15 Siberian divisions that saved Moscow in December 1941 exist now mostly in archives and memories. Their soldiers are gone, their battles forgotten by most. But their lesson endures. Never underestimate an enemy adapted to their environment. Never let ideology blind you to reality. Never assume superiority when facing specialists on their own ground. These truths, written in blood in the snow outside Moscow, remain relevant today. Because human nature hasn't changed. We still prefer comfortable beliefs to uncomfortable truths. We still underestimate enemies we despise. We still think we can overcome material reality. December 1941 says otherwise. And winter, that most honest of teachers, never lies.